ce grand séminaire aux UG. Nous sommes ravis d'accueillir aujourd'hui un membre éminent de notre fédération aux UG, en la personne de Sandra LAVOREL. Donc, Sandra est chercheuse au Laboratoire d'écologie Alpine et elle a reçu en 2023 la prestigieuse médaille d'or du CNRS pour ses 30 années de carrière à explorer le fonctionnement des écosystèmes. Ses travaux pionniers en écologie fonctionnelle ont mis en lumière l'importance cruciale de la biodiversité pour la société humaine, ainsi que les conséquences sociétales et économiques des altérations environnementales. Elle affectionne particulièrement les Alpes comme terrain de jeu, et où elle reproduit les effets du réchauffement climatique sur les prairies d'altitude. L'ensemble de ces travaux viennent régulièrement éclairer les politiques d'aménagement et de gestion de la biodiversité des territoires. Titulaire d'un doctorat en écologie et sciences de l'évolution de l'Université de Montpellier, Sandra a enrichi son expertise lors d'un post-doctorat en Australie avant de revenir en France pour contribuer dès 1994 au Centre d'écologie fonctionnelle et évolutive de Montpellier, puis au Laboratoire d'écologie alpine en 2003, où elle continue de mener des recherches de pointe. Membre de l'Académie des sciences depuis 2013, Sandra a publié au fil de sa carrière plus de 300 articles dans des revues de référence et compte parmi les auteurs les plus cités de son domaine. Avant que la médaille d'or du CNRS ne lui soit décernée, elle était déjà lauréate de 14 prix prestigieux. Son expertise l'a également conduite à participer à diverses instances d'évaluation nationales et internationales, notamment en tant que membre du comité interdisciplinaire d'experts de l'IPBES, donc c'est la plateforme internationale de référence sur la biodiversité, pour lequel elle a œuvré de 2018 à 2022, en tant que co-autrice du rapport GIEC-IPBES sur la biodiversité et le changement climatique en 2021. Son parcours est source d'inspiration pour chacun d'entre nous, soulignant l'importance fondamentale du travail collaboratif et de l'engagement individuel pour comprendre les enjeux écologiques contemporains et dans notre quête de solutions novatrices pour un avenir durable. Donc, je te remercie, Sandra, d'avoir accepté de faire ce grand séminaire aujourd'hui pour tous les collègues de la Fédération OSU.
Merci, Nathalie. Merci à tous d'être là aujourd'hui. En fait, je remercie chaleureusement ISTerre pour l'initiative de m'inviter à donner ce séminaire et donc la possibilité de donner un séminaire aux UG, ce à quoi je tenais particulièrement, puisque je souhaite que mon travail rayonne localement, pas juste sphère internationale. Donc, je vais passer en anglais pour l'intérêt des collègues qui ne maîtrisent pas forcément aussi bien le français. So today I'm going to be telling you about our research, trying to think about how we should manage and decide about our landscapes for adaptation to climate change that is based on the capability of nature to support our livelihood. You'll be certainly familiar with the fact that we are living through multiple crises, multiple environmental crises, and that these crises are linked, like those of climate and biodiversity. For this reason, solutions need to be searched jointly. We now have international targets that were negotiated through the years to protect a significant proportion of our land, sea and water areas in order to protect the biodiversity that sustains people's livelihoods. In particular, there's this kind of magic number of protecting 30% of land or seas, which doesn't come from nowhere. It's just not just from negotiation. It's actually based on sound science, illustrated here, for example, with a synthesis of the effects of forest cover in landscapes and regions on biodiversity and thereby on the benefits that it provides to people. And we know from evidence, from synthesis of this evidence, from modeling, and in fact from physical theory, that in any medium that's arranged randomly or non-randomly, there is this threshold of connectivity around 30 to 40% of an element here, forest. Ideally, we'd like to protect far more of the land surface. People have talked about the half-Earth hypothesis, for example, where to protect biodiversity in efficient ways, we need to actually protect half of the Earth land and sea surface. Yet, as humans, we also have demands on surfaces for our other needs, for example, for producing the food that we eat every day, and also to host the biota that we benefit from. And so this threshold of 30% reflects these trade-offs. The recent joint report between IPBES and the IPCC concluded that in order to address the joint crisis of biodiversity and climate, we need to not only act on one ecosystem at a time, one city at a time, one system at a time, but that we really need to take an integrated, a system approach that considers together actions for nature conservation and for climate, and of course, the benefits of the people and equity of these benefits. So people have been trying to synthesize knowledge, develop hypotheses, continue to work on how much habitat, natural habitat, do we need in here I'm talking about land, but landscapes, so that we meet, in fact, diverse goals. Nature conservation is indeed one of the objectives, but we also need, for example, to manage land for production. We need to protect ourselves from natural risks, and all of these need to actually be traded off within landscapes. The concept of nature-based solutions has recently been developed internationally and put forward in particular by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature to address societal challenges, including climate change adaptation. You will be probably familiar with some of the nature-based solutions in this slide, which are the more commonly the ones that are most commonly communicated about, and that are to do with natural risk management. So, for example, coastal protection, protection against floods by wetlands and trees, climate regulation in cities, and slope protection in mountains, like in our region. So broadly, nature-based solutions are often referred to in terms of climate change mitigation, so sequestering carbon, in particular in above ground vegetation in trees and soils, and for risk mitigation. But nature can also have some other contributions to adaptation that are to do with the resilience of ecosystems, the ability, for example, to sustain natural and changing climate variability through their biodiversity, their ability to respond and transform in response to trending climate change, and also the ability, because humans are very inventive, to support new economic activities, as some ecosystems will change irreversibly. We know this. These nature-based solutions are now experimented in many places, including here in the Alps. And one of the challenges is to actually see how to amplify them, how to implement them over large scales. Modeling approaches have been developed to examine where we could best locate such nature-based solutions for climate adaptation. Here illustrated in the Alps from the PhD of Titouan Dubo, which was with us at LECA, as well as with Ignacio Palomo at ISTerre. Here we were able to model how to address, illustrated here, drought risk to ecosystem, but also to economic activities, depending on areas that would either have a deficit or an excess in water. This allows us with some geospatial analysis to identify on the bottom panel priority in the areas in the Alps for distributing new nature-based solution interventions. So this work at continental scale is important, especially politically and also for regional implementation. Yet, I would contend that people really mostly connect with the regional scale, and many decisions, in fact, are made at a regional scale. And this is the scale at which I work. I'm taking here an illustration from one of the other places I work in New Zealand, the Mackenzie Basin, which is an area that is, as many places around the world, challenged by changing climate, changing temperatures, reduced snow cover, and also increasing drought. For areas like this, we can actually, we know the range of nature-based solutions that could be implemented to do with changing agriculture, with regenerating native forests, to do with letting natural succession occur. But we don't know where to locate them in these landscapes. And for this, we can develop various scenarios using multiple approaches. Here, this is a design approach done with design architects. So this gives us hypotheses that we can then test with modeling approaches. So continuing this study, for example, here we modeled coupling vegetation models, climate scenarios, and hypotheses about which conditions would be favorable to different types of nature-based solutions, including novel crops, sustaining slope protection and erosion, or new activities to do with tourism, and modeled how they could be distributed through this landscape across various scenarios. Here, an extreme climate scenario. One of the important points when we examine such nature-based solutions in this landscape or across regional scales here is that in reality, no particular intervention to a given risk, illustrated here for drought, is going to have a single benefit. Here, Titon Dubo analyzed the multiple benefits of nature-based solutions across of 100 nature-based solutions, which we have as a database across the Alps, and found that even when one single risk was targeted, let's say drought, as you can see, it flows on to multiple benefits, not only to do, for example, with food or wood production, but multiple other aspects. So our starting point is that nature-based solutions are in fact multifunctional. We've developed, based on this, the concept of climate-smart landscapes. The notion of climate-smart is not new. It's been developed in agriculture and applied in forestry and urban design, and refers to the fact that we can hit multiple birds with one stone when trying to address climate risks. I've illustrated this multifunctionality here from the point of view of our interest for managing landscapes as a bit of a tripod, where in addition to climate risk mitigation, climate risk adaptation and mitigation, we also have to trade off with being able to continue and develop environmentally sustainable and resilient food production, or possibly wood production as well, and biodiversity conservation. And so climate-smart landscapes are about trying to trade off and reconcile these different goals within single landscapes. These have been, the climate-smart concept has been implemented, as I already mentioned, in agriculture, but mostly in tropical regions and a bit in Europe and Australia, but there's still a lot of evidence that's needed. And often in reality, it has a strong climate mitigation focus and doesn't focus as much on the two other objectives. So let's go back to our regions and trying to think about these landscapes where we live. Previous syntheses, mostly in biodiversity conservation science, have confirmed that we need at least 30% natural or high quality ecosystems in landscapes to provide habitat for biodiversity and to sustain the functions that we need from these as humans. These studies also show that we can really only afford a maximum of 30% intensive land use in landscapes in order to not prejudice the benefits from these conserved areas and to allow, in fact, for complementarity in landscapes from less intensively used areas, the remaining 40%. These are referred to and are continued to refer to as optimal templates for multifunctionality because they're hypothesized to be best for these multiple objectives of climate smart because there is complementarity between different parts of the landscape that have different different land uses of different intensity, and also because intermediate land use is actually the source of many benefits, for example, by including trees including many areas, but many habitats for beneficial organisms. Further synthesis and actual conceptual thinking has proposed that these ideal proportions should actually be distributed through landscapes in patches of varying sizes. For example, complementarity with some very large and a few very large and many small native vegetation patches, the presence of corridors to allow all these functions that we want to benefit from. However, this is actually conceptual thinking, and these hypotheses have actually not been tested, nor do we have a formal understanding, a theoretical, complete understanding of how this should be, why this should be. Indeed, if we think about these multifunctional rural landscapes and our three objectives, there are two extreme ways in which they can be designed. This one, which is sometimes referred to as land sharing, where, as you can see on these pictures, whether of a European landscape or an indigenous landscape, here pictured for pre-European New Zealand, all elements are intermixed at fairly fine scales. So you can see there's trees interspersed with agricultures, there's bits of natural areas. Contrasting with this, another model, which is sometimes referring to as land sparing, actually suggests that instead we can distribute these different types of land uses and these different benefits at larger scales across landscapes, and in particular across catchments, where different functions are fulfilled in broader sections of the landscape, but are then complementary at a regional scale. This is the source of many publications, a lot of debate. I won't today give any statement on which is best. In fact, it really depends where you are. Rather, as a scientist working on climate smart landscapes, I'm interested in finding out where and when and why different configurations will be of interest. I'm going to try to explain to you with a very easy cartoon why landscape pattern matters for multifunctionality. If you compare the bottom two figures of the cartoon with the top two, you'll realize that there are more trees, the green patches in this landscape. So you will be familiar by now, there's a lot of communication on trees. That's when you have more trees in the landscape, this increases your carbon sequestration. This provides better and more wildlife habitat. This contributes to flood and erosion regulation. But there's a little trade-off here. If you're in a region where fire matters, this also increases fire risk. If you compare instead the two columns from left to right, you will realize that on the left, we have bigger patches, and on the right-hand side, we have smaller patches for the same area of forest. And here, so keeping the area of trees constant, and therefore essentially constant carbon sequestration, in fact, if we consider that different species of wildlife have different requirements, some like open areas, some like forests, the effect will be variable and depend on species. In fact, we don't know a priori which configuration will be better for flood and erosion regulation. And we know for sure that this will decrease fire risk. And indeed, this remains a critical knowledge gap. How should we design landscapes that will provide these multiple functions that we need in the face of climate change, and which mechanisms need to be considered in the design of these landscapes? The aim of my and my collaborators' current research is to research systematic causal explanations of how landscape composition, so how many trees there are, how much intensive agriculture, how many grasslands, but it's importantly how their configuration determine the multifunctionality, because we're still lacking such theory. For this, among other methods, we've been using what we call virtual landscape experiments. So you might be familiar in your own research with in silico experiments, where we use modeling with experimental designs like you would in the field to compare different hypotheses and different scenarios. So here, without going into details of this particular design, for a study that we deployed in with parameterization for New Zealand, we compared different landscapes that were either close to our ideal template or that were more extensive or more intensive in terms of agricultural use. So this is our starting point where we actually changed the composition, and we actually distribute different land uses in a simulated landscape. But what we did here was to try to explore, caricatured here with a simple cartoon on patch size, whether we would get more benefits by having landscapes that consist of many small patches or landscapes that have big patches. And so using approaches that actually come from physics initially and have been implemented, well, you know, in actual virtual computer games, we've developed some algorithms to distribute our land uses into landscapes based on essentially stochastic allocation rules, but also taking into account a bit of reality like terrain, whether we have a flat or hilly or a mountain terrain, and in later irrigations, for example, stream networks. With such, yeah, and I should just add, these approaches, you generate multiple stochastic replicates of these landscapes so that you have a real experiment with multiple iterations, and then you can actually test your hypothesis on effects on the multiple functions that we are targeting here. So this cartoon summarizes results from one of these simulation studies where we looked at the benefits of these different landscape types. So moving from extensively used landscapes, so with a lot of nature, a lot of natural grassland, to very intensive grassland on the right-hand side. But this, in a way, wasn't of much interest to us. Although, if you look from left to right, you can see from the size, the total size of the square, that, of course, when it's extensive, we've got more benefits from nature. But we knew this. We didn't need to run all these simulations for that. This is kind of obvious. What interested us more was that if you compare, again, the top and the bottom, which correspond respectively to the big patches or the small patches landscapes, you can see that especially at the intensive end of the gradient, there is quite a large difference between the benefits for example, pollination or the regulation of erosion or the regulation of water quality, its nitrate content, when we move, in this case, to finer grained landscapes. So this is the first answer. First, it matters. You can see it's different between the two. And in the case of the functions that we looked at here, the fine grained landscape was more beneficial. These were very simple simulations. And in more recent research, including with Margot Neret, who has so in the room here, currently postdocing with us at LECA, we have been researching the effects of the more advanced effects of landscape, so-called landscape ecological connectivity, which focuses not just on knowing whether we've got bigger and smaller patches, but also more complex features like linear features in landscapes, for example, corridors of hedgerows or corridors around rivers, and how this will support multiple ecosystem functions through so-called ecological connectivity. So here again, with this same approach of virtual landscape simulations, Margot was able to compare landscapes where we have multiple small elements and linear features to which will always be the left-hand side of the graph, and landscapes where we have perhaps more nature protection in bigger areas and fewer of these small elements, all of this for a constant area of natural vegetation. And what we found here, which makes total sense for people working on biodiversity, for example, is that if you look at the two left panels, depending on species, we will have benefits for we will have benefits of different types of landscapes. So the left panel are species that benefit from larger patches of trees and forests. But if we look at pollinators, for example, on the top right, well, these organisms actually benefit far more from a fine-grained landscape. And illustrated here, one of the services to humans that we examined with our models was recreation ability. And this was also favored by bigger patches. So we can look at these different, the benefits of these different types of landscapes for various functions, for various biota, which we can then analyze as management objectives. So here we have 4 types of management objectives. Obviously, they are caricatures. It's not quite how the world works, but in fact, this is how the world works. Many decision makers work in one silo. So if you're interested in sustainable crop production, where we modeled production itself, but aspects to do with carbon storage, but in emissions, and aspects of soils, erosion and nitrogen, pollination and pests, along with some species that are beneficial that live at the edges of production fields. This, along with the functions that benefit climate mitigation and adaptation, show decreasing slopes of response with increasing aggregation, so bigger patches. So these actually benefit from smaller patches in the landscape, like the results I showed you in the first simulation. However, if we focus on interest in biodiversity protection, and especially many of the species that have that are priority for nature protection in our legislation, as well as if you focus on landscape cultural value in terms of recreation and watching some animals that we might be interested in, then you find the opposite result. So what do we learn from this? Well, in fact, there is no ideal landscape for our multiple objectives. It's always going to be a compromise. And ultimately, it's not about ecology, it's about decisions and where our priorities as a society lie. What this also tells us probably is that we will need a mix of these different configurations. The answer we don't have is at which scale. You know, do we mix them like large patches and small patches, like I showed you in a cartoon in a single landscape, or do we do this over a larger scale, like a watershed? So far that's basically all these models that we've been looking at. They're based, I didn't give you any details on them. I'll be happy to answer these questions, but they're basically ecological research. We use what we know about species habitats, species dispersal, various biological processes to do, for example, with the regulation of nitrogen in soils and water. But this is only one side of the coin. Because any of the adaptation solutions that we will put in place don't fall just from the sky. Biodiversity is just not here and benefiting humans. In fact, we have human interventions that are needed. So contrasted here for my New Zealand landscape, again, we contrasted 3 types of solutions. Those that will benefit from the vegetation, the ecosystems that we will preserve, so we call that persistent. Those which are direct human interventions, so for example, planting trees, and those which are actually quite frequent in this landscape because we actually have invasion, especially by coniferous trees from plantations, those which actually will transform spontaneously in response to invasive species and climate change. So as you can see from these maps here, the 3 types of solutions are very different. And in particular, the ones that are related to more or less human input are very different, distributed very differently from those that are to do with conserving landscapes. All of these require a certain human investment, here calculated in terms of economic, financial investment. and require capital input. This actually means that in order to get whichever benefits we want for this landscape for adaptation, we will need lots of money. For people to interact with these landscapes, both in terms of decision and investing into them, but also in our daily lives, as I told you, we actually are going to need to make choices. There is no single solution. Don't come to us as ecologists to tell you what is the solution. Ultimately, it's a choice. And in fact, people do associate values with different landscape elements. And this is what we need to take into account. Also essential for adaptation, as in any decision to do, well, with our part, at least with ecosystem management, anything to do with climate action, we need to be concerned about how the benefits from different landscapes will actually be distributed across different parts of the population. And so this research on designing landscapes for these multiple objectives, these climate smart objectives, also need to take into account the demands of various people, their aspirations, their values, as well as to whom these will be benefiting. Such questions have been examined by multiple disciplines in, or are being currently examined by different disciplines in social sciences. One of them is economics, to which I've already briefly referred with the McKinsey case study. Here, a study that was developed in the state of Victoria in Australia looked at how different strategies across different farms, which are the squares, or the polygons on these maps, to restore vegetation would actually change benefits to biodiversity. And without going into details in this study, which hypothesized different modes and willingness to collaborate between neighboring farms and across the whole catchment, they basically found that it was actually beneficial both for landowners economically and for biodiversity to collaborate across the boundaries of farms, including to establish corridors between their farms. So this is the kinds of things that we can look at with economics approaches. We're also interested in the broader varieties of barriers and levers that will favor biodiversity and socially favorable interventions, these nature-based solutions. And this can be analyzed considering the multiple aspects that affect implementation and the ability to scale to an entire region. These are to do with people values, which I've already referred to, with economics aspects, but also with institutions, governance, and also with knowledge, its generation, its presence and ability, and how people can access it, how we can share it. This was, for example, analyzed here in the Grenoble region as part of the Portal project by Enora Brulet. And what she found very interestingly, in both in analyzing planning documents and in working with stakeholders of the regions from multiple economic sectors, is that none of these levers can be activated by itself, but it's really about their interaction. So, for example, if we as scientists believe that we need more knowledge, this knowledge is not going to benefit implementation of nature-based solutions at scale in our region, the Grenoble region on its own. It's only going to be working if it's actually developed and communicated together with adequate local governance, with working with people who are doing the landscape planning, and as well as feeding into the policy framework. So that's one example. But what essentially she found is that all of these levers are actually very intimately interacting. They're like cogs working together. And this really requires a system approach to implementation. It's nice to say this, but you will realize that this is actually quite complicated to implement. In further work, we've continued to analyze this and say, okay, it's very nice what we find in Grenoble, but we'd like to know how this happens more broadly. And we try to analyze this with a more generic framework that could be implemented globally. For these, we realized that it's about analyzing the interactions between ecosystems and landscapes, both from within ecosystems and within social systems, but also across them. So that instead of looking at relationships from nature to people, from people to nature, and within each of these compartments, in fact, the conceptual framework that we proposed was that we really need to look at a network of interactions between elements of nature and societal elements in order to understand how social, well, what we call social ecological adaptation, so this adaptation based on managing nature, but also on distributing equitably across people, on taking people into account people's values, needs to be considered as a whole network of interactions. So at a workshop actually funded by OZUG last year at the marvelous Sainte-Croix Monastery, I don't know if any of you know this place in Drôme. I encourage you to have workshops there. We came up with improvements on this conceptual framework, but importantly, 18 operational variables that we could quantify for case studies around the world to try to describe these networks of interactions. So there were these were taken as 3 sets: ecological interactions, social interactions, and social ecological interactions are to do with values of nature. So with collaborators from our network, the people who are in Sainte-Croix and other collaborators around the world, we have been able to test our framework on a first set of 26 case studies, which represents different levels of involvement of people with nature, which, as you would see from the geographic diversity, represents in particular various cultures and people-nature relationships, and which, as we will see from the results slightly, again, happy to talk more about those in questions, came into the adaptation actions with a different focus. There are regions where, and even within a given area, for example, France, you might come in with a people priority, or you might come in with, say, a nature conservation priority. So we try to have essentially a diverse set of case studies, as one does as a scientist. And this has allowed us to develop a typology of nature and people linkages that are found around the world for nature-based adaptation. Apart from the first one, which is actually consists in initiatives that mostly involve people and they're very tech-oriented, so just putting a plantation and not caring about people locally, all of them involve different levels of our different variables and represent, in fact, alternative models, and neither of them is better than the others. What we see from this is that there exist alternative models for developing adaptation that is based on nature. I'll give you a few rapid examples since I'm still on time. In this case here, which is actually in Spain, a community has worked together and a bit against the foresters to reestablish trees on their landscapes. To establish agricultural areas in a landscape where the spread of trees following land abandonment was a big danger to do with recurring fires. And they actually tried to think through the types of agriculture that would actually also act as fuel breaks while being economically profitable. And here, in this case, the focus was really thinking about, in fact, it's like in the little models that I showed you, about these connectivities in the landscape and what will benefit some species, what will prevent the fire from spreading, etc. So that's one possible perspective. In the second example here, this is an example that was really strongly people-oriented in the Solomon Islands, where, as you would be aware, they're facing, like many other Pacific islands, they're facing sea level rise. And at this moment, not only sea level rise, but salt intrusion into their land, which really affects food production, among other problems. And here, in this case, people are really focused on trying to essentially, in fact, improve the livelihoods of people already today, and in the future, in the face of climate change. And a strong focus here was really on the social aspects of, especially on, so if you remember the cogs that I show you from NRS work, on the capabilities, people's capabilities, knowledge sharing, as well as essentially how institutions need to be changed to be able to implement nature-based adaptation. And the last case, for which I've taken one example from previous work that we've done in the Drone Valley here, shows you how, in the as in our fourth type from our analysis, in some cases we have heaps of interactions. So the adaptation is really based on managing landscape for biodiversity processes and its supportive processes. It's about lots of aspects of nature governance, water governance, land governance, and it's also about many interventions, all the adaptation actions that you see on the right. So this is like a super integrated. I tried to take on purpose a really complicated figure, which is in supplementary material of that paper, to show you how complex the interactions are in the system. So that's just, it's just to leave you with the message that there is no one formula, neither for landscape configuration, nor for how it works on the ground in terms of interacting with people. So I'd like to leave you with these few messages to address the joint crisis of climate and biodiversity and all the other crises. We need, of course, to focus on the ultimate causes. I didn't talk much about this, but it's to do, in the end, with what we found, with what we addressed, which has to do with values, with institutions, etc. Meanwhile, we still need to understand how integrated management can address integrated management through adaptation by nature can help us adapt and mitigate to climate change and mitigate it. We've only started to scratch the surface in terms of this work, and we still need a lot of work on designing climate smart landscapes from the biophysical sciences as well as from social sciences. And what we currently conclude, and that concurs with emerging findings around the world, is that in order to really be able to deploy these solutions, to scale them up towards something that will take us to the right trajectory for our world, we need to intensify the people aspect, how people relate to nature, how people relate among themselves, so that we have all the energy and resources that are required for conserving, restoring, and managing nature and all its complex relationships that we depend on. So I thank you for your attention, and we'll welcome your questions.